Okay, so the two teachers I want to talk about today, I've had them both at university, at college, and they made a difference. I've always thought of teaching as being one of two things, two approaches, particularly at a tertiary level. One is that you can display mastery. That is, you can inspire your students by showing, what is possible and ask your students to rise to that level. And the other one is where you get to know your students, you get back down onto their level, and you try to bring them up to a certain level that you're happy with. And the two teachers I want to talk about today did that in various ways. I'll talk about Dan O'Neill first. Dan was I did a number of subjects with Dan. I was quite sort of drawn to him as a teacher through university. And he was one of those guys who displayed mastery that kind of inspired me to want to learn more. He sort of indicated a way in which knowledge could be the kind of knowledge I was learning English, literary studies, and Dan knew a lot. He he was one of those old school teachers that had been brought up through the system without a doctorate, and he had a remarkable knowledge of literary history and literary theory particularly. And he displayed that in the courses that he taught. The problem with Dan, however, and this is sort of, I would use Dan as kind of a warning, I suppose, that he was a kind of old 60s, late 70s radical in Queensland, where I was brought up. And Queensland at that time was run by quite a authoritarian sort of government. Not authoritarian, you guys have just gone through 4 years of it, so you kind of know what I'm talking about in America. And one of the outcomes of that was a ban on civil liberties. People couldn't march in protest. That was banned. The police were very heavy-handed here. So the sort of student movement through that period was very strong. And Dan had grown up through this period, but unfortunately it left him with a distaste for students, he was often saying that students, when I was going through, were less engaged, less active than the students of his era. And that kind of contempt, I suppose, came through in his teaching. But one of the positive things I learned from Dan was that the subjects he was teaching, which was literary studies and English, you could take them very, very seriously. And he had a great wealth about the vast knowledge of literatures in European literature, from ancient Greek through to contemporary theory. And he was really well versed and well read. And he taught me, I guess, how to read very closely with things. But he'd often come into class, and I did this I did about 4 or 5 classes with him, and at every, because he was a kind of 60s radical, he had this idea that, we should all participate in the construction of the course that we were about to do. We should, have some say in the assessment. And every time I had him, the very first tutorial was this kind of extended discussion about what we should do. And regardless of the length of the discussion, it always ended up being the same thing, which was what he really wanted. So he was one of those guys who pretended, I guess, or gave lip service to the idea of participation in a classroom, but didn't actually perform that very well. He was quite a it was his way or no way, really, though he gave the pretense that we were all involved in some way. And I guess one of the negative things I learned from him was he used to tend to overwhelm, I said, students with his with his vast knowledge. And that sort of led to everyone feeling a little bit like they shouldn't be there, that they were very, they were very quiet. They weren't up to the level that he was. And I don't think he could quite overcome that barrier of finding finding common ground, which I think would have been good. The other teacher that I want to talk about is Martin Duwell, who only had for one subject at university, but that subject was Australian poetry. It was contemporary Australian poetry at that time in the second half of the 20th century. And he was exactly the opposite. He was very open. He tried to make things accessible to students. And I did some poetry courses before, but with Martin, he really opened up the world of Australian poetry to me. Again, he made me see that it was important and worth talking about, but he'd often come in and tell some jokes, make fun of people, in a friendly kind of way, and get a discussion happening. And in contrast rather to Dan's classes, he was he got a great deal of participation, and people, including myself, who hadn't really got into poetry or couldn't really understand poetry, he opened that whole world up for a lot of people, and me in particular. And I came away from that course with a love of some of the poets that he was interested in, and a way of understanding and reading poetry that has stuck with me since then. So, two different styles of teaching, and I think both of those teachers made a difference to me, to the way that I approach some of the things that I was interested in.